Thank you, Tom. Kind introduction. It is good to be here with you today in the Riggs Library, one of the most special places on campus to be sure. And to be in the library in finals week seems appropriate. You students are probably just feeling nervous. I have to get back and study, and so you're gracious to share time with me today. I look forward to your questions and your comments. For those of you that might be doing research papers, be as technical as you want to. I'll defer all the hard questions to Rebecca Neal, my colleague who's with me today. But to each of you, thank you for joining us. I did have an occasion to enjoy this room on a very special evening last year. President DeGioia hosted a dinner, and he was honoring Mark Dybel, who's another colleague of mine at the administration. He's an alum. And as you know, as you may know, he directs the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is a profound public health strategy. And it was a delightful evening. I mean, the room shows nicely with candlelit tables, and what a special way to enjoy this part of your real estate. But it was also fun to hear the stories between your president and Mark, and then another gentleman who, as soon as I found out the event was here, I've been trying to search my memory bank to recall his name, and I can't, but there were three of them in a row that served as assistants to the president. First was Jack DeGioia. He was assistant to the president, and then I think Mark was second. So Mark was President DeGioia's successor. Dan Porterfield, yeah, who was at my table, I'm embarrassed to say. But they all were at our table sharing stories from those days, and that was great fun, and it was fun to hear the inside account of what their experiences were like. And then when Mark gets at the podium, recalling his student leadership days and his interests. Of course, he went to school with so many that come to Georgetown with dreams of becoming the next Secretary of State and foreign diplomat. And he was not just going to go down that path. He was dedicated to a life of mission. He wanted to be a public health doctor, and he wanted to be scientific and toil in great advances, hopefully, in medicine, and to serve people that way. So he stood before us that evening as one of America's best and highest profile diplomats. And so many of the people, I'm sure, that went through the School of Foreign Service are off doing other things. Well, he went through public health and ended up being a very important diplomat, working with heads of state in developing nations on the pandemic that is HIV/AIDS, and honoring you all on campus by how he's growing Georgetown's legacy and reach in the world. It was a delightful evening. The Berkeley Center, Tom, is very impressive new creation here, reflective of your president's interest and intellectual interest, but also his desire to see Georgetown be of benefit to development and diplomacy and interreligious dialogue, which is important to your school's mission, but important to the places that you're having impact, which is literally worldwide. In the Berkeley Center and your leadership and with your colleagues is, convening and producing scholarly work and bringing diverse voices together toward some common purposes and to some really tough challenges. And our world really demands no less in the globalized, complex place that we share now, and the negative underside of globalization, like human trafficking or terrorism, or the upside of globalization, the fast transfer of people and money and talent to solve problems like HIV/AIDS. And you're providing a stronger foundation with which to understand those problems and to advance solutions. And so I commend you and thank you for convening today's event. And hopefully I'll do you justice by a few remarks here. The President's Faith-Based and Community Initiative, which we're here to describe today, you can go to the first slide, is a few things at once. It is the longest standing initiative of this administration, which is not unimportant. You remember the compassionate conservative sort of clothing that he wore on the campaign, and I will be sharing with you today is indeed tenets that are central to so much of the governing strategy then of this 43rd President of the United States. But he spoke much of the Faith-Based and Community Initiative before he called it that, to sort of translate what that philosophy looked like to him. I won't try to guess what the President's theology is on these matters. I can tell you a little bit about my own, though, and what I hear in his compassionate, conservative origins for this work, and it's truth and grace. I think the president wants to hold high standards, and he wants to, create better conditions for us all to exercise, our talent and to seize opportunity. But at the same time, recognize that not everybody benefits from the marketplace or in society. That there are the least, the last, and the lost, and sometimes circumstances get rather overwhelming. And that it's a just and compassionate society that knows that and recognizes that and sees government's appropriate role, but then realizes that there's a big difference between a federal strategy and a national strategy, and that historically in our land, a national strategy looks like each of us playing a role and seeing many private efforts in the public interest too. And so he talked a lot about these themes, and he talked about government and its role in poverty fighting, more in the transaction business, and the role of faith-based and community groups, which is more in the human transformation business and how we need to be better partners together. He talked about on the campaign. His first major policy speech was in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is where I happen to lead the think tank that you heard about, and actually spoke at a site that we referred to as a Front Porch Alliance project, which was indeed a faith-based and community initiative led by Steve Goldsmith, who may have spoken on this campus, a dear friend of mine from the administration. And so this really goes back a ways for the president. He talked about the campaign. He had an initiative as governor of Texas that sort of led on several elements that I'll be talking about today. So it goes back a long way, and it says current is this afternoon. The 9th day of office in this picture is depicting the 9th day of administration. The president's in the Indian Treaty Room, the White House, which is room 470 in the 4th floor of the Executive Office building, where no Indian treaty, by the way, was ever signed. I don't know why it's called that. But a very ceremonial room, the place where the first televised press conference was held. Eisenhower held press conference there. But in this ceremonial room, 9th day of the administration, the president signs in 2 executive orders, bringing to life his faith-based and community initiative, marking its first, the administration's first new initiative in government. And what that executive order did is created a White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. It also created the first 5 centers for faith-based and community initiative in federal agencies. That has since grown, and I'm going to say something about that in a little while. In the picture you'll see, the gentleman on the far left is Dr. John DiUlio. Some of you may know him or know of him. University of Pennsylvania professor who had written on this issue as a social scientist extensively. A remarkable combination of being a faithful Catholic, a Democrat, a scholar, a big practitioner. He's very engaged in Philadelphia grassroots charities, strengthening those organizations. So he brought all, as a matter of fact, he advised Gore and Bush on the campaign. He's just a remarkable character, and he served as one of my predecessors. He was the first director of this office. But he was announced that day alongside the gentleman to his left, which is Steve Goldsmith, who I mentioned and was a big force in the campaign, who had been one of the nation's leaders as mayor of Indianapolis in this work, hence the president's speech in Indianapolis to kick this work off. And Steve Goldsmith was announced that day as chairman of the Corporation for National and Community Service, which some of you may have heard about. That's the AmeriCorps program, VISTA program, is administered by that organization. And the president said, we're going to be talking about and advancing through this initiative a citizenship strategy. So we're going to talk about nonprofit organizations, another way of saying faith-based and community groups, and we're going to talk about volunteerism, because private citizens solve problems in communities. It's the best of who we are, and we're going to be better in government in organizing strategies around that. And so they were announced at the same time, along with other community leaders behind them, to say that this is a new way of doing business. We're going to say that we're going to acknowledge some historic truths, which is that citizens organize to solve problems, and they do so at scale. And we're going to be a better partner to them. We're going to end some of the discrimination that the president thought in 2001 existed, in particular against 2 groups. One, faith-based institutions. There were many federal policies, rules, and regulations that inhibited government's partnerships with faith-based groups. And we'll get into the law in a little while too. There's an appropriate balance in the First Amendment. That means government shouldn't be the church and the church shouldn't be the state. But historically, faith-based groups just solve a whole lot of problems. They're very active in communities, and they do so oftentimes with private support. but for decades had done so as government's financial partner as well. And in those financial relationships, we've figured out, even with much more intentionality these last 6 and 7 years, how to respect the religious liberty of every individual who may be of one faith, another faith, or no faith at all, and who deserves taxpayer-supported services in an environment that's respective of wherever they come in from a faith persuasion. At the same time, recognizing their unique characteristics of faith-based groups that should be protected if we care about effectiveness. And how does that balance achieved? Well, it's as difficult as achieving the balance of the First Amendment that protects the free exercise of us as Americans to practice religion, and therefore the organizations that form based on that faith, and the protection from state picking a religion and showing favorites and compromising religious liberty. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the presentation, but on the front end, we recognize that there would have been some overcorrection. There have been a lot of laws, particularly a lot of anti-Catholic school laws in the earlier part of the last century that pushed case law and government practice, even beyond case law, away from government partnership with faith-based organizations. So one group that we were trying to level the playing field for and open the door wider to would be faith-based charities. The other set of organizations that we were interested in ending discrimination against or encouraging more partnerships with were smaller grassroots organizations. It's very hard for these grassroots groups, who are oftentimes the one that solves the biggest problems. It's the neighborhood, 1, 2, 3-person shop that serves the drug addict and in a relational way stays with that person, day after day, week after week, and really loves them through their withdrawals and their temptations and their struggles to help. And they're beautiful public servants as they practice their work, sometimes motivated by faith, sometimes by their goodwill for a neighbor. Those organizations are oftentimes led by a social entrepreneur who can do some of the hardest work in our country's business, and that's helping somebody to help that's really struggling with a high dysfunction. But they don't know how to keep their books oftentimes, and they don't know how to compete for grants, and we really don't want them to have a grant anyway, all the paperwork that's involved and the difficulty that is. So how do you engage these smaller groups? Well, I'll touch on a couple of strategies we've come up with in the last 6 years, but that was the other organization, that was the other of the two that the president said we need to mobilize more. These are really strong groups. They provide a very valuable public service, and we're going to go after it. So the executive orders did these 3 things. Brought the initiative into government at the White House, meaning it's attached to the president. We're going to be a part of his leadership for 4 or 8 years, and embedded the initiative at federal agencies that administer human service programs. And in particular said, we're going to try and be better partners to these 2 groups in particular that have been marginalized in America's governing strategies over the last 20, 30 years in particular. I can switch. But it was all based on a big idea, which is before you. The president didn't form this as the faith-based initiative. We're actually the faith-based and community initiative, which is intended to be a lot of words that is hard sometimes to say and remember in the right order, but is very prescriptive and intentional. What we're saying is that we are interested in faith-based groups, the faith factor, and we are interested in community-based groups, secular organizations, but we're also interested in our middle name a second way, which is that this work plays out in community, and so we're not just interested in 2 ends of Pennsylvania Avenue working out what they think about this, but are we adding value to communities and those that serve neighbors in real places and in real time. And indeed, our mission is very clear in this statement. The president said, this is a determined attack on need. This really isn't about process, even though there's a lot of process points we need to consider. This is about growing compassion. This is about growing effectiveness in social service. And this is about saying that human trafficking and dropouts and all the other AIDS and malaria in Africa and so many other social issues that plague us are unacceptable when we can do something about it. When we have the financial resources and the capacity to stand up and say not in my neighborhood, not in my sphere of influence, that we should. And the president was calling us to that type of action. So he labeled it a determined attack on need and gave us this charge. And so that is the big idea, and that's indeed the mission with which we're pursuing. Mm-hmm. in these 5 ways in particular. So this is going to be the kind of the clunkier or wonkish sort of part of the talk. How do we organize? Well, I already said that the first 2 executive orders set in motion a certain structure. White House Faith-Based and Community Initiative. I direct that office. We have about a dozen people in the White House that serve the president on this portfolio. We now have a dozen federal agencies, so the first 5 have now grown to 11 formally, and there's an additional federal agency that voluntarily aligns with us. And so those are prescribed centers within agencies, meaning that we have directors of this initiative at these dozen federal agencies who respond to their cabinet secretary and to us, and work out the big ideas of the initiative in the context of their agencies. So we touch every single human service program that government's interested in, from USAID and international development programming to HUD and affordable housing and other pursuits. Again, I'll unpack this a little bit more fully in a couple of slides. But so we're structured that way. We have a very extensive, probably 60 or 70 staff that work across this administration, advancing this determined attack on need sort of focus, saying these problems are unacceptable, we're going to address them more effectively in partnerships, government with civil society or nonprofit groups. And then tactically, we've gone after 4 kind of elements I have here, or 3, played with this graphic a little bit. Let me start with the triangle, and then I'll explain the other 5 points are actually the next 5 slides, so I'm going to unpack them in a little bit more detail. But let me say that these 3 sides of the triangle are really probably the best 3 ways to understand the types of strategies that we've cooked up over these 7 years. And that goes to the earlier point, too, about this being the longest running initiative. If you read the press accounts, you hear a lot of different things about our initiative. It's just a political thing, or it was maybe a good idea, just poorly applied. What you don't hear is a lot of substance of the initiative, which is really too bad. We have done so much, and we've changed so regularly. I mean, we have all these people working on strategies within agencies, so we're proliferating different approaches. And some are working and some are not. And we need to know the difference, and we need to make adjustments on those things that aren't strong, and we need to build on those things that are working well. That's what good research offers, and that's what good policy making looks like, and that's what our initiative looks like on a day-to-day basis. We just released a report earlier in this calendar year called The Quiet Revolution, which is a 7-year progress report. And it's really just a descriptive document. It's 150 pages just saying, this is generally how we've organized, and this is generally the policy foci, and this is generally the partners that we've mobilized. I mean, it took 150 pages to frame it and not unpack it and not share the research yet. We'll be doing that throughout the year, but it's a very complex initiative. But I think it broadly conceived, the strategies and tactics fall within these sort of 3 sides of the triangle. Governance strategies, I've been talking about that so far. We've organized within government. We've said that while civil society matters, that we know that it's these private voluntary groups, volunteers, faith-based groups, community groups, and neighborhoods that matter, that provide services. It's our job to be better in creating an environment for them to flourish, and maybe to be their sponsor, and certainly to be their partner, and in financial ways or non-financial ways like information sharing or strategy development and other strategies. But there's a host of government strategies, and I'll touch on a couple more of those. But it's not just rules and regulations that we cook in Washington and in a context of governing. It's recognizing that there's inherent strength and value in faith-based and community groups, and we should build their skills. So capacity building is part of our mission. What does it look like to just create stronger organizations and create more volunteer opportunities and create more philanthropy, incentives for philanthropic investment, pro bono services by companies or actual investments. But the capacity building side I'll touch on too. And then this notion of community, that we do need to sort of test our effectiveness in real places in real time, and we need to push out our emphasis beyond legislation and rulemaking into the gubernatorial realm and what's happening at the state level and in local public administration and in communities at home and abroad, and we do that as well. And so those 3 sort of sides to our work are broad categories with which so much of our activity falls. And now I've identified kind of 5 keys to give you a little bit more detail and texture about what that looks like. The president meets with his cabinet infrequently. I don't know what previous presidents do, but this president meets maybe 4 to 6 times a year with his cabinet. And this was February 4th, 2008, the day the federal government's budget was released. And on this day, at this table, this is actually a picture of that meeting, the agenda was, the president led, he spoke very briefly to frame the agenda, to offer a couple of leadership thoughts, and he turned to his right and asked the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, to describe what was happening in Iraq and the democratization process, and he turned to his left and he asked Secretary Gates to explain what military strategy was pending in Afghanistan, and he turned further down the table to his left and asked Director Nussel, the Office of Management and Budget Director, to describe the budget that was being released that day, which happened to be in electronic form for the first time. So we got a whiz-bang demonstration on how the budget showed up on a laptop rather than a 1,000-page publication. And then he looked across the table and asked Secretary Paulson to talk about the stimulus package, of which you should be getting your checks maybe next week, I think I heard. And then he turned to his right, sort of at the 2 o'clock window, and asked Secretary Chao to talk about an immigration strategy that she was working on at the Labor Department, and asked Secretary Chertoff at the end of the table down here to talk about some border control issues. These are the weighty matters of state, and they're the highest elements of his agenda during that season. But the meeting didn't end there. The meeting then turned to a non-cabinet member, myself, who's not seated at the table, because only cabinet members with brass plates behind their chair get to sit at the table. I was sitting with senior staff in the back row. But it is such a signal of the President's commitment to this initiative and his understanding that this is an initiative that is a governing strategy, is something that's central to our priorities and to how the American government functions, that he asked me to give an update. It had just been our 7th anniversary on January 29th of this year. We celebrated the 7 years since he had signed his executive order in the Indian Treaty Room. And so he asked me to give an update, and I spoke as long as they did, and had the floor, and I was able to go around, and I won't burden you with too much detail here, but I could speak to every cabinet member at that table and talk about the center that they lead, or the initiatives that they have created at their agency to create more faith-based and community partnerships. Because 7 years later, this president has taken a sentiment, which is that the nonprofit sector is important in society, and made it a critical element of his governing strategy. And the only way to implement that is to do so through his cabinet and his government, that which he has direct contact and control over. And I think it's a poetic gesture in the context of a slide, and a poignant element of who we are, that it is central. And with great humility, I'll say that we're strong in some areas and not strong in some areas, and we're still growing, but we're doing so at the table. Had never been done before in American government. Even though we've had partnerships with faith-based groups for a long time, to be this intentional is a profound new way of doing business in American governance, and this picture symbolizes it. So there's governance. There's other ways that we're working within the agencies that advance strategies toward big problems, and also techniques, policies that we've used to level the playing field for faith-based groups and mobilize and integrate more grassroots groups that I referred to either. But I'll defer to question and answer time to give you details there to check your interest level on that. But let me shift gears and talk about capacity. We do a number of things to execute that strategy. This is a picture of who? Indianapolis Colts head coach Tony Dungy, who is at this point in this photo reigning Super Bowl champion, won last year, of course, and before the Giants won, but this was before this year's Super Bowl. And interestingly, this photo was taken the day after. Do we have some Bostonians in the room? Okay. This was the day after the Colts played the Patriots this past season, which is quite remarkable, actually, that our keynote speaker, on the heels of a tough defeat, actually, would be willing to, this was an Indianapolis conference, but to but to leave the film room dissecting what went wrong the day before, which we could get into, but I'll defer to the question and answer time for that as well, to be with us and speak to his role as a member of the President's Council on Service and Civic Participation, of which he serves. He believes in public service. He has been very active in prisoner reentry issues and counseling and other strategies to strengthen America's youth and to strengthen America's families. He's a remarkable man, actually, and a terrific leader. So he serves on that council. And this is a picture of a great leader like Tony Dungy, who was speaking at a conference series that we hold. We have trained more than 100,000 social entrepreneurs in White House conferences on faith-based and community initiatives and in federal agency workshops designed for faith-based and community groups all across the country. Because as I said earlier, we're interested in doing business with these groups, forming partnerships with them, but not just that, not just a grant-making story. We're interested in these groups getting stronger and healthier anyway, because that's our contribution to the nonprofit sector. We want to leave that sector better than when we found it, because we think more citizens get served better if that occurs. We're hedging a bet on that. We think these groups are vitally important, and we want to strengthen them. So at these conferences, we train them on these groups on how to recruit volunteers, and we train them on how to build boards of directors and raise private money as well as partnering with the federal government. And a host of other strategies that are issue-based. And we get all the federal agencies to come to these conferences. So if you want to talk to the Department of Agriculture, because you're interested in international food programs like we're reading about in the papers today, and how awful the situation is and how much more we need to design new strategies, or you're interested in affordable housing solutions at your home, and you want to talk about your specific story and set of circumstances, we bring federal officials there for you, and you can access them, and it shows the initiative in real time. And then we have through our agencies, some very tailored training. And so we have, as I said, trained more than 100,000 of these leaders, and we also speak to federal and state and local officials about how they can do partnerships better. So conference activity is a big part of what we do. We design electronic tools, not only at the White House, but throughout these federal agencies that design tools to train organizations. And what we're doing is building on the Tocquevillian notion that we do privately assemble and associate with one another to solve problems. You know, Tocqueville's, among his famous comments is his observation that if tragedy befalls a stranger, the purse strings of 1,000 others. Or if tragedy befalls a person, he said that the purse strings of 1,000 strangers open up to him. I think that was a correct diagnosis of the situation. I think that is what happened early days in America as it does now, but I think he got it wrong on rhetoric. It's not the purse strings of 1,000 strangers. Oftentimes it's the purse strings of 1,000 neighbors that open up people that are in their proximity. And that was an early observation of our country. Today, the nonprofit sector in America, 1.5 million registered organizations, have a combined revenue base and assets that would make our nonprofit sector the 6th largest economy in the world if it were a country. It's an enormous number of resources that flow through these organizations. And the numbers of 60 million or so who volunteer at these organizations, you know, nonprofits and volunteers aren't nice for us to have in society. They are necessary ways for us to solve problems. And so again, we're interested in building their capabilities, growing them. We want more people to volunteer. We want them to volunteer more strategically. We just held a pro bono summit calling on corporate America, much like President Kennedy called on the lawyers in the civil rights era when he brought lawyers to the White House and said, you know, we're passing these civil rights laws. It'll be very hard not only to adopt them, but to implement them. So we're going to need you, the legal profession. We're going to need you in your communities. Getting the back of these people and to helping make sure that these laws become real in their life. And that began the pro bono culture that is dominant in the legal profession today. Well, we had a summit a couple months ago on Wall Street calling on corporate America to offer more pro bono services. We know from research by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that companies are oftentimes generous, and they are oftentimes generous two ways. One, even if they're large corporations, they give locally. Oftentimes they invest in their own communities where their employees live. That makes sense. But they oftentimes give their people even more than they give money. Well, that's a great thing. That's a strength. We want to leverage that strength. So we want more of that to happen. But we also want to take advantage of the skill set. You know, we're interested in skills volunteering. So if you ladle soup and you show up and help at a homeless shelter, that is nice and that is important. That's not unimportant to do. But if you're an accountant and you can help one of these fledgling social entrepreneurs keep the books, that's even more strategic. So we're proliferating strategies in that realm as well. These are all ways to build the capacity, capabilities of the nonprofit sector. Probably pushing in my 20 minutes here, so I'll scoot through a couple of these slides. The place conversation, the next two slides pertain to it. I mentioned that we're interested in community, we're interested in effects, and is this felt value to community leaders, policymakers, as well as the charities themselves. Well, there's two big portals with which we're working to make sure we can get to community. One is governors and another is mayors. The National Governors Association this year is chaired by Tim Pawlenty, governor of Minnesota. Last year it was chaired by Janet Napolitano, governor of Arizona, one Democrat, one Republican. They represent the 35 governors across the country that have their own faith-based and community initiative. The president could not sign an executive order and make those states have faith-based and community initiatives just as he could in federal government. He can sign an executive order and make that happen in a dozen federal agencies. But in the states, it's voluntary action. These governors, 19 Democrat, 16 Republican, have formed initiatives replicating the federal strategy because it's good government, because they want more partners. They want to design strategies to strengthen their ability to solve problems and to reach further into places and to problem sets that plague them. So we're a partner with the National Governors Association and these governors, and in places where there isn't a faith-based and community initiative yet, there are strategies that are forming that I'd love to tell you about if you're interested in the state side of this equation in the question and answer time. The same thing at the city level. This is Manny Diaz, who's a mayor of Miami and incoming chair of or president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And so we know that this is a natural constituency for us. If we want to devolve in a sort of federalism strategy, that we want to move from the federal agencies, 80% of the federal government is actually spending is determined by state and local officials. You oftentimes think about all the tax dollars coming to Washington and us just writing the checks here. Well, we write some of them and not small amounts. But most of the spending is determined by state and local officials. Most of it goes through block grants, and it's not highly discretionary, but it could be because it's in a block grant, and it could be creatively deployed, and a lot of it is creatively deployed through grant competitions as well. So it's a big deal what happens at the state and local level, and they're the ones who have partnerships at the street level. I mean, the Conference of Mayors are fond of saying, poverty to them isn't a national set of statistics. It's not a poverty rate. Poor are their neighbors, they're their constituents. I mean, they're people they serve and people they hear from. They don't hear from people that are just people who are complaining about the potholes. They complain about people that don't have good jobs and they don't have enough food and they don't have adequate housing. And so this is a felt need. And so this isn't an academic or political or rhetorical exercise with state and local officials. It's very pragmatic. That's why we have 19 Democrat, 16 Republican governors who have voluntarily implemented this initiative over the past 7 years. That's why 12 states that had gubernatorial transitions after the faith-based and community initiative was started in their state have maintained the initiative in the next administration, even when the parties changed. It's a remarkable statement. I've been around politics long enough that the new guy wants to get rid of the old guy's thing just because, even if they stay within the same party, because it's a branding issue and it's politics. But this initiative has preserved its identity as well as its influence and impact within successive administrations at the state level. It's a big deal. But we know we need to be good servants to the governors and the mayors to implement this initiative because that's where the groups reside. And then switching gears, we're also very active internationally. Rebecca and I just returned with our team from Rwanda and Zambia, where we held White House conferences on faith-based community initiatives, the Tony Dungy picture. And if I had pictures from those events, you would have seen President Kagame in Rwanda, who hosted us and was our keynote speaker and spoke to the value of partnerships in his country. And First Lady Maureen Mwanawasa, who in Zambia is both First Lady of that country but also chairperson of the Organization of African First Ladies Against AIDS. And what we were talking about on the heels of the President's travel to Africa earlier in the year is that partnerships make health programs work. You may know, and Berkeley may have researched the fact that healthcare Infrastructure in Africa is somewhere in the 50% range of faith-based sponsorship, and so it's faith-based organizations just loom large in healthcare delivery and education services. PEPFAR, the Mark Dybel story that I led with, this initiative that he's responsible for, is a $15 billion investment, the largest investment by a single country toward a single disease in the history of the world, is a lot of money, and it's a lot of money spent in 15 focus countries because we want to talk about good governance and we want to work with leaders who we can trust and who can take responsibility for those dollars. Also because that's a way that we can push out performance and set performance standards, and it's a way that we can localize the work. So of the $15 billion that have gone out, those dollars that have fit into grants to organizations to deliver the work, 80% of those dollars have gone to indigenous faith-based and community groups. And there's a picture of Zambia's. So all across the country, thanks to PEPFAR, we have mobilized indigenous NGOs who are benefiting from your tax dollars, thank you very much, and saving lives across Africa. What we think is good about this, in addition to the obvious and the frontline sort of support, is that when we're done funding them, and we will at some point pull funding back or shift them to new priorities, they're going to be better organizations. These are sustainable solutions because they reside there, and we've built them up and strengthened them, and we've invested in them, and they're going to be a lasting legacy. President Bush oftentimes talks about the way we can supply resources, and we should, because to whom much is given, much is required, and we're a blessed nation, and we can take care of the poor at home just as we have enough resources to respond to the poor abroad. But if we do so this way, in a way that respects local organizations and leadership, then we have invested in a sustainable strategy as well. And just a quick word about development. You've probably researched this and reported on it already, but we talked a lot about in Rwanda, where we address public-private partnerships. We're in Zambia, we focus a little bit more on health programs. That 40 years ago, American foreign assistance looked like a 70% investment by way of congressional appropriation, taxpayer dollars, and a 30% investment by private dollars. Well, today, I don't know what the overall number is. Maybe you do. We've 4, 5, 10 times whatever the aggregate amount is 40 years later, we're spending a lot more in the developing world. But within this larger pie, 80% is private and 20% is public or taxpayer supported. So we've grown the 70% number, we've actually grown the whole number a lot of congressionally appropriated support to the developing world. But how much more so have private dollars proliferated? Well, that's not going to stop. With intergenerational wealth transfer that you read about, and globalization and the flat sort of strategies where you can do Kiva and get your money over to a social entrepreneur on the web, we're just going to see more of it. It's a remarkable statistic. So with President Kagame in Rwanda, we unpacked that and talked about that new marketplace and strategies. Rick Warren, who spoke here downstairs a month ago and sponsored by you, made $1 million commitment at our conference in Rwanda to faith-based groups that will help deliver more health care in Rwanda. We celebrated a number of private strategies, and it was remarkable. It was a remarkable trip. But here, again, is a way of saying place matters. So through state and local strategies, as well as through international strategies, this is an initiative on the move. This is an initiative that's going to be tested by our reach in real places with real people. In other words, faith-based and community groups are indispensable allies. And just as you teach at the center and across Georgetown, you can't be interested in diplomacy without being interested in development, and vice versa. And I would say and commend a new speech by Secretary Gates to you too, that even the Secretary of Defense is saying you can't talk about national security without talking about diplomacy. And so again, with a hats off to you all for what you do to contribute to that dialogue. We're doing our part as a partnership strategy to lift that up and say this is what it looks like, and what a healthy way then to enter conversation about interreligious dialogue when you're in a place like Rwanda, which 5 years ago across the continent of Africa, 50,000 Africans of the tens of millions that were afflicted by the HIV virus were receiving antiretroviral life-saving drug therapies. 50,000, and they were paying for it themselves. That's why AIDS was a death sentence. In Africa today, the number is 1.4 million. This is the Mark Dybel, Georgetown grad success story. But in Rwanda, a country the size of Maryland, physically, we celebrated at our conference a few weeks ago the 50,000th patient that country has treated, thanks to PEPFAR. And so you go to a place like we did, an institution, a faith-based clinic, which was where the first AIDS patient was treated in Rwanda, and you find out that there are, Catholics treating Muslim patients and other ways, that's, sort of care is playing out and surprising people and enlarging, the role of faith and the understanding of faith in remarkable ways. It's very pragmatic, very street level, very heartfelt, and in a very healthy way for us to do diplomacy, of course. So next slide is the final one on the sequence, which is that life change is really what it's all about. And there's a picture of the First Lady. We were in New Orleans together. She's made 30 visits to the Gulf region. We've worked on a lot of partnership strategies. Our next conference, Following Africa, will be in New Orleans at the end of May, and we'll talk about some research and some strategies that we've done to build up the faith-based community groups there that, of course, were first responders to Katrina and are the last out the door, too. They stay there and help neighbors deal with the depression that follows the disaster and all the complexities of response and the schools that have formed. The Catholic schools did such a great job of reaching out to so many non-Catholics and poor and others befitting your social mission. And while these centralized strategies, policy change, creating better environment, funding strategies that are our responsibility when you're in charge of government, and all these federal agencies are important and a part of our job. We know those things need to get unpacked in communities, whether they're at home, these governors, or abroad. But what's the real test? If it's a determined attack on need, the real test is life change. So every month at the White House, I hold a Compassion in Action roundtable where we take on different problems like human trafficking. Anybody know how many slaves exist in America today? Sort of audience participation. 30 million slaves are the best count today in the world. Oh, did I? I'm sorry. Yep, thank you, Professor. That correction. Yep, I'm sorry. Worldwide, 30 million slaves. And these are sex slaves. Oftentimes, they're indentured servants making bricks, and horrific stories about kidnapping. And you've read some of these accounts. Well, it's actually the third largest illicit criminal activity in the world today, and on pace to overtake narcotics and guns. I mean, it's a really bad problem, but too few of us know, much about it at all. So we had a policy roundtable and said, that's unacceptable. That's just wrong. And so we featured what the State Department's doing and the Labor Department's doing and HHS is doing to enforce and to care for victims and to partner with other governments, and the invaluable role of faith-based and community groups on both sides. I mean, International Justice Mission, you may be familiar with them, a faith-based charity, is on the ground doing enforcement. Former Justice Department official that leads that organization, and he mobilizes local law enforcement to get them to do their job, to break this stuff up in faith-based charities that provide victim care. And so we talked about that, and we say, unacceptable, we need to do something about that. Heroic acts of faith-based and community groups that are solving this problem, and celebrate them, and then turn our attention to what needs to happen next. How do we grow these solutions and multi-sector partnerships? And same thing with the dropout issue. Did you know that 1/3 of American students drop out of high school before completion, 1/2 in communities of color? I mean, that's just fundamentally wrong and unacceptable in a knowledge economy. Wrong for them. Creates less security for us. Do you know there are more adults who have dropped out of high school? There are more adults of that type in prison than in jobs. American dropouts. It's a good way to get in trouble. It's a good way to live below your potential. And so we get to say that's wrong tomorrow at a round table, and we get to lift up the strategies that are working in society, faith-based community groups, and then we get to think about new strategies together. So, we talk about human need, and we hopefully advance solutions toward meeting more of that human need, but we're able to say, this isn't a political deal, this isn't a rhetorical deal, this is a human sort of felt deal, which is hard to get an article written about. We have a White House press corps, you may have heard, they trail the president around, and they're invited to each of these events, and these themes are, to us, really substantial questions and really inspiring stories on how these really big problems are being solved. And it's pretty hard to get coverage for them, you know, and it's interesting. Maybe you have some observations on state of journalism. If there's journalism students in the audience, you can give us some tips. But we can't garner a lot of attention. You know, if we had an event, you know, focused on controversy, you know, you can get a lot of attention. But if it's this type of problem solving, it's hard to get attention, and it really is a problem. It's unfortunate. So let me talk about controversy and then wrap up here. Next slide, which brings us back to your mission and a big part of ours, which is the first part of our name, the faith factor. You know, while we are not just the faith-based initiative, which we're called that sometimes by virtue of having a really long name, and they shorthand us sometimes, and by virtue of the fact that we place so much emphasis on faith-based charities that they think that's our priority interest, and it is a big interest of ours. You know, while we're not just that, you know, I wanted to be very intentional saying we're interested in secular nonprofits as well, and within the faith factor, we're interested in a pluralistic sort of faith set. We're the government, that's our job. But while we're broad, we're also narrow, and we're also interested in the distinctives of the faith factor. And you know, you read research. Putnam's coming out with some really good new research on religion's influence in volunteerism and philanthropy, and we can't do problem solving without it. It's the largest driver. It's the biggest reason we give our time. It's the biggest reason we give our money, and that's why you go to Africa and you work your way to a dusty village, and the only institution that's there is a faith-based organization, and that's because our mission's large, us people of faith, and it shows up in those kinds of ways. And if you're interested in governing, and if you're interested in problem solving, you need to understand it, and you need to do business with it, and hopefully you can make it stronger. And so that is a big part of you know, who we are, of course, and that's why, again, I applaud so much the Berkeley Center and what you're doing here, because you know, it's just not an option anymore. You know, illiteracy is not an option. You know, if you want to care about world affairs, and you know, for a long time we didn't even teach it, and we didn't talk about it much, though, the role of religion. Well, it's just hopefully a unfortunate part of the past, and so we're trying to add some value there, but it's hard, and I think one of the reasons it's controversial in public space is that these three things get confused. This is kind of what I'm going to wrap up on, and it's a little bit of a theoretical model here, but as I think about our work in particular, and what we're trying to advance on faith-based social services and the faith factor in service, a lot of times people just think politically, you know, and if you're interested in religion in the public square, politics is a dimension. You know, thank God for Martin Luther King and what he did to lead the civil rights movement, and he thanked God in that work. I mean, it was faith-based, it was spiritually centered, why he did it and how he did it in many respects. We see less attractive, less successful elements of this, where religion is sometimes not very attractively deployed in the political space, and I'll let you come up with examples on your own there. I won't cite them, but you know, it's not all good, but it has led to, you know, ending apartheid and ending the civil rights and promoting women's suffrage, and so many other social causes oftentimes were led by religious leaders, and that's a great thing. And so political debate, advocacy is a dimension of religion in the public square. It's an interesting one. It's a distinctive one. There's another dimension, which is the other side of the slide, which is First Amendment jurisprudence, or what church and state law looks like. And we have a long history of getting it right and sometimes not getting it right in American First Amendment jurisprudence. I referred to this earlier on the school laws, which were the Blaine Amendments, which maybe you've studied, that very unhelpfully shrunk faith-based participation in education and social services at the state level, oftentimes out of anti-Catholic bigotry, and it's just wrong. And it's real. It's happened, and so there's some corrective action that the courts have taken over the last 20 years, and moving from a pervasively sectarian standard, meaning if you're so religious you can't have any public value, which is sort of what pervasively sectarian means, sort of a clumsy layman's description of it, to equal treatment, which is the case law that's predominant today in America. And that just means that faith-based groups, by virtue of their faith, aren't necessarily better or worse public servants, that they should be treated equally, and based on their performance and their capabilities, determination should be made on whether they can add public value and whether they are appropriate partners to government. But all those legal questions represent a second category, which is church and state law, and that's another part of religion in the public square. But the center is us, primarily in this initiative. The faith factor in service that I had just earlier made reference to is a whole different dimension. You know, this is just being motivated by your faith and believing that the tenets of your faith require you to live outside yourself for something bigger than yourself and toward a neighbor in need, which all the world religions have some version of. Isn't that correct? And so that's our interest space, you know, with this initiative. We want to celebrate that, and we want to grow it for the benefit of those who are least, last, and lost, and who hurt. And that has, to be sure, some legal dimensions, because if that motivation translates into a group seeking financial support from the government, then all of a sudden we have church-state law that matters. That ignites that element of the conversation. And so part of our training, capacity building that we offer, establish legal do's and don'ts, things you should do and things you shouldn't do if you're in a partnership between government and faith-based organizations. First Amendment does have parameters, and our initiative, while sometimes criticized as knocking down the church-state separation, really should be lauded for how much intentionality we've brought and guidance we've brought to the issue, because there are complexities, and we're the first administration that really lifted that up and provided hundreds of pages of guidance and a whole lot of training sessions on this in particular. You know, so there are a number of faith-based charities we say do not seek government funding. If your spiritual mission is so infused in your service and you can't separate that from your secular outcome, it's just a bad idea for you to seek a government grant, because you will get sued and you will lose, and it'll be your expense. And we're able to talk to policymakers to say, do not discriminate just cause on the front end. I mean, be thoughtful and deliberative. And to corporate America that oftentimes doesn't fund faith-based charities because they think that they're bound to First Amendment jurisprudence. Really, there are corporations that think that, well, I can't fund this group because it's breaking the, sort of Thomas Jefferson, wall of separation metaphor. I mean, there's just poor understanding. So we've lifted that up and offered some discernment and some description. But anyway, all that to say, I think these three dimensions of religion in the public square are different dimensions. And I think they relate to one another at times, but not always, and not by definition. And I think we do better if those of us that are championing this work draw some lines of definition. So at least we know at what level we should debate or have a discourse. And I think we should embrace the complexity there. Are we at the end? One more? Oh, what's next? Each candidate has spoken to their general appreciation of faith in society, their own personal faith to a certain degree. Each candidate has spoken to their specific appreciation of, if not support for, the faith-based and community initiative. John McCain has called it one of President Bush's biggest successes that has received not enough attention or credit. Obama at the CNN Compassion Forum a couple weeks ago, specifically, without being asked this question specifically, stated that he'd want to keep the initiative and maybe run a little differently. And Senator Clinton has a long record of supporting the initiative and being a friend of the initiative, actually. So politically, there's a realm of conversation you may have a question or two about. That's part of what's next. What I spend more of my time thinking about is what transition looks like and what the substance of the initiative is and should be in the future. And got a whole bunch of ideas about that, but you must be so tired of just listening to me. I'm gonna wrap up here and trust you to ask good questions about that. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
That's a great question. EJ has been a long time. Is that what you call him? Do you get to call him EJ?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's been a long time observer of this issue. He's written, published on it. Let me be a bit playful. How much of my presentation has he covered in his class?
Well, I mean,
has he talked about the substance? And
a little bit. I mean,
yeah.
Each day was a different portion of religion and politics. So
yeah.
One class session was about the opposite.
I see. It wasn't a class on the initiative.
No, it's
Yeah. Good. We have some. We have gotten a lot of attention because it's my point of view actually that even really thoughtful people like EJ, and he is. I mean, I just admire him, and he's a very serious scholar. A lot of what I talked about, your eyes, I could see, were getting a little heavy at times, a little warm in here late in the day. It isn't interesting stuff to hear about, but it is really important stuff. So the essence of the initiative, really the bulk, if you could somehow quantify this, the 90+% of the initiative, it's just really public administration, and it's nonprofit sector stuff. And so I guess the first thing I want to say in response to your great question is it's a tough communications challenge for us to be able to be properly understood, because the bulk of what we do isn't political. It's very pragmatic. It just isn't that interesting to people that aren't in that direct line of fire, because they're not providing services, or they're receiving services, or they're governing in this way. And so just acknowledging that, and again, sort of being thankful to each of you that wanted to hear that and came for that today. Let me go to the question directly. The 2004 info sessions, I don't think existed. I don't know that for sure. I know the controversy with which you're drawing reference, and my immediate predecessors, a guy named Jim Toohey, he was director of the office then, and I think that there was a claim that he went out to congressional districts and did info sessions. I think what happened is he did training on this initiative in districts, and so I don't know what probably the discrepancy I might have with maybe the characterization of EJ, or maybe not. Maybe we were saying the same thing, is that it wasn't a political session. It was a policy-making session. And if they happened in congressional districts that were targeted or interesting, close elections or whatever, I honestly don't know. But I wouldn't deny that, because I don't know. I don't know they were held. But I have no evidence in any of our files or any of my investigation of that era that there was political activity. That somehow they were helping a Republican candidate and not a Democratic candidate. Jim Toohey and John DiIulio, by the way, were both Democrats and Catholics. I'm an evangelical Republican. But the interesting thing, I'll unpack your question a little bit further, because the book that documents this in most detail, of course, is a book by David Quo, a former member of our office who wrote Tempting Faith. And he pleads guilty during his service in our office to advancing a political strategy, to try and become more relevant. And then he says, that's just awful. It's just awful to be doing that. So at one level, he's sort of pleading guilty and then sort of condemning it. And unfortunately puts the emphasis then on the political dimension. He talks very little in that book, which is the most widely read book about our work, broadly conceived, and says almost nothing about human need or what we're doing to organize strategies and building partnerships. And I didn't walk you through the detail of our presidential initiatives on prisoner reentry, mentoring children prisoners, and substance abuse, access to recovery, these various strategies. I mean, this is really sort of a comprehensive work. Quo was famous for saying that he never darkened the door of an agency. He was much more interested in the RNC. I don't even know where the RNC is. I literally don't know where it is. I spend all my time in the States and the agencies and on policy work. But let me go further on your point, which is, what's the role of politics in this initiative? And every White House does politics. And every priority, therefore, of each president has a political dimension. So in the White House, we have an office like mine, which is initiative specific, and we have a mission, and we chase that mission, and we try. Ours is term attack on need, problem solving through partnerships. The White House Office of Political Affairs does politics, so they're interested in outreach, and they're interested in friends that they're trying to get in Congress to advance that. Presidents, what's shareholder value in a company? Well, you can see it on a balance sheet. What's the value you achieve in politics when you're in elected office? Well, votes are one of them. It's a good thing for us that he was elected twice for the agenda we care about, the compassion agenda, and it's just part of the deal. And mobilizing political support to get certain attention. And so this isn't a defense to your question. This is just sort of a open-ended, this is an interesting part of the conversation. Politics are going to be a part of it, which has some pluses and some minuses on presidential initiatives. If this was a political science course, we could play with this a little bit and say, having a president of the United States name this initiative in his top 3 to 5 priorities, before the administration started and while it is finishing, is a big deal. The attention we get, the culture change that has resulted because grassroots faith-based charities get noticed now and there's favorable attention, that sort of thing that a president can do, is a positive. and the politicization that happens in Washington, D.C. generally, or in a White House, or in a speaker's office, or whatever, has other dimensions, you know, and there are factions, you know, that result in competing. That's just the reality of governing, and so therefore it's a great question you raise, and it'd be fun if that was our theme for this talk. We could have gone, you know, this long, because there's so many different sides to it. So I'd be interested to hear more of what EJ says, but I appreciate the question. I'll try not to be as long-winded. You want to? Okay.
I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm at the Berkeley Center. I've been to a few of the monthly meetings, which I think are fascinating. One of the last ones, though, I think you weren't there, was the one on food.
Well, you called me out. Well, thank you.
And one of them, one aspect which struck me as very interesting and telling, was that it was a couple of months ago, before the explosion of interest in food issues, and you could already hear one of the strengths of faith organizations, which was that they were seeing the impact in the increased numbers of people
coming
internationally and nationally coming, their pain, more and more working families.
Yeah.
But now it's on the agenda, and I'm interested in your comments on what role the office will have and where you see this going. Working with this huge and complicated community on an international
on issues like that.
Crisis.
Right, exactly. Well, these events do a couple of things. One, they profile an issue, you know, so whether it's food insecurity at home or abroad, or trafficking and these dropouts issues. You know, so there's a bit of outreach and education and advocacy. Really, we're doing it at that, I didn't know prophecy was one of them, or we're predicting sort of trends that happened there perhaps. But that's one function. But these aren't destination events. You know, that's not the point. The point isn't to raise awareness and then go on to the next theme. These things happen along the stream of governing. So what we're doing is adding value to that which we can influence on that issue space. So we're elevating the issue space, which helps our teams internally. You know, we have a center at the Department of Agriculture, which was profiled there, and I think the Secretary was at that event. And so practically and politically speaking, we're able to raise the profile of these issues before their Secretary and among a constituency that matters, which gives us stronger relationships and hopefully clearer understanding of what the research is saying and what partners are saying. It leads to things like other events and other of our ability to speak into deliberations. You know, there was a big Kansas City conference just a few weeks ago on international food issues, and our event added value to that event. But on a day-to-day basis, and this is really the point I was making earlier about governing, that we have a Center for Faith-Based and Community Issues at Agriculture means that team plus us, when they engage us, every day speaks into that issue in one way or another. And so if we were just the White House office, we couldn't do that because we wouldn't know enough about it. We can't become experts in their day-to-day, and we can't have relationships with the international division bureau chief or whatever. But our center can. That's literally who they work with on a day-to-day basis. And so they're able to use the White House and say, we need to inform the National Security Council or Domestic Policy Council of this, and we can do that. I can do that. You know, I can meet with the president. I can meet with those council heads, and I can get informed by our center that carries the compassion agenda over there. So it's an artful exercise, these events, because it works outside and it works inside. That's at least our intent. Yes. Yep.
Tom Reese with the Woodstock Theological Center.
Sure.
I'm curious, you know, the Catholic Church has been involved in partnerships with state, local, and federal government for decades before this initiative in housing and care for children, food, shelter programs. How have you seen the relationship with Catholic agencies like Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services? How has that changed or improved as a result of this initiative?
Thank you. That's a good question. Well, Larry Snyder, who runs Catholic Charities, and I are good friends, and we've participated in conversation. I seem to recall that at his gathering last year that I spoke at, I think he made the claim that Catholic a Catholic interest, and I don't know which group, had the first government contract. So I don't know where that comes from and how authentic that statement is or accurate, but I seem to recall that. So indeed, there's no question it's a long history of formal partnerships. It's a different type. We can't help an established, mature, far-reaching charity like Lutheran Social Services or Catholic Charities in the way we can help a new guy get in the game. It's just a different objective. But what we can do, and you'd have to ask Larry or others how well we do this, we're a natural ally to them. We care about the same things. If, another way of classifying our work, if you will, is that we carry, a big share of the compassion agenda within the administration. That's part of my job. When there's budget battles about which percentage of dollars are going where, which, Catholic Charities will weigh in on, and others about where they think increases should go on food issues or others, we're part of that cause. We want to see a greater response. Now, our initiative isn't all about growing government, so there may be differences of opinion about percentages and strategies and tactics, but we meet generally in that space. We care about the same stuff a lot. And so we give, hopefully, those groups a little bit more traction. We don't advocate for any group on grants or, it's not our job. And we're not a funding agency, we're a policy agency. So we don't help in that retail of a fashion. We meet at the level of agenda. So to make your question a little bit more abstract, what can we do to help an established large charity? And I think we help each other, in strategy more than maybe sponsor to recipient, the way we would help, a more grassroots organization. Yes.
Hi, my name is Vaishali. I'm a grad student in the physiology department. And in full disclosure, I'll tell you that I used to work at Americans Unite for Separation of Church and State.
Yeah.
That given,
We probably don't share mission the same way. That's what.
My question is more regarding, we were talking about providing, service for as many people as possible.
Yeah.
But with religious organizations, how do you prevent from discrimination in hiring practices and also in providing services? Specifically, I'm talking about like the Iowa prison interchange prison ministry case. So.
They're great questions. I'm really glad you're here. Actually, it's great that you are. This is because these are really vital questions, and the fact that you're interested in separation issues means that we actually do have some things in common. I mean, we do not believe in just pervasive, sort of extension of church over state. Sometimes it reads like that in the press. And we really think the intentionality of drawing the lines between what complies with the First Amendment of the Constitution, but which is driven by our larger mission. We're not interested first in church-state separation issues. We're not interested first in grant-making issues. We're not interested first in how government organizes itself. We're interested first in growing the supply of effective compassion. So, for example, if we see prison fellowship, you say the Iowa example, if we see prison fellowship being the only group interested to go behind those walls, prison's walls, and say to those inmates, that 650,000 of you will leave prison this year, and 2/3 of you will be rearrested within 3 to 5 years, because that's what national statistics show. And that makes the place where you move less secure, that makes you frustrated, that makes your family free. So they're going to pour their lives into those men. And they're saying, instead of the social network that got you in that trouble, receiving you back in community, we're going to put a mentor from a church outside the gate if you're interested and if you want to engage. And they're sacrificially doing that. And other groups are able to do it too, because prisons, case law says, provide some open space for community groups, faith or otherwise, to provide services. Prison Fellowship's one of the few that shows up and does that. So we think that's great. And we know it makes a difference because we've studied faith-based mentoring. Yet, it could be done the wrong way. If the state of Iowa gives them a grant or a contract that pays for the spiritual mission of prison fellowship, our guidance at the White House says you actually shouldn't do that, because that would not protect the religious liberty of every inmate. We can't guarantee that. But if we're paying a faith-based charity to do the secular work, of job training, for example, case law seems to be pretty clear that under the equal treatment premise, we could do it. So I tell the story by way of saying, it isn't either or. It is about growing supply. Any prison fellowship, any Muslim, Jewish, secular charity that wants to go in and serve that prisoner and help them, we admire. The president oftentimes talks about people of faith, different faiths, or no faith at all, and they're all precious Americans and valued Americans. But we're burdened by reducing the need first. That's our mission. And an element of that is the faith factor. And whenever that faith factor translates into a financial relationship, all of the ACLU points, that are legitimate questions and points are ignited. But those same concerns are not real, I don't think you would say this, if there wasn't a government grant involved. So if that's, so I just wanted to say that our angle view is wider than that. But it's also respectful of the points you raise. And in an ideal situation, I don't want to debate Barry Lynn about who's right or wrong. I'd love to think through with the advocacy community and others, where that line fits, because it isn't either or. Is there going to be government contracts with faith-based charities next year? A lot of them. Probably about $2 billion worth of faith-based charities will receive a federal grant next year. And we didn't start that. That's just a big part of how American governing happens. We're just trying to make it smarter and more aligned with First Amendment principles. So I really do think, the heart of your question is something that we take very seriously, that we work hard on. And also just a quick aside on that $2 billion point, in California, for example, why these state strategies matter, California does not have a faith-based and community initiative. They just haven't organized an office yet. Faith-based and community groups in California, last year that we counted, which was 2006, the California faith-based community groups won $1 billion from the federal government. No involvement of the governor necessarily. These are just groups in their communities that are sophisticated enough to find out how education, HUD, labor, and others offer grant competitions, and they won. This is the scope and scale I was referencing earlier. That's a big deal. So in many respects, California has a vibrant faith-based community initiative, and they've been organized around it. So we like to see people follow President's leadership here about forming strategies to say, if I'm governor and I just cut my human services budget last year, but now I'm aware that these same groups in my state won $1 billion that I didn't know were government dollars that came into my state, I ought to factor that in to my government strategy. So that's a bit of a spin-off from your question, but hopefully I covered an answer in the first part of it. Yes, these two, and then I want to be respectful of your time.
Two more, Scoop.
Okay.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Jose Canto. I'm a sociologist here at Georgetown.
Nice to
For
see
the
you.
past 3 years, I've been working on faith-based work here in D.C., in particular what churches and synagogues and mosques can do to solve the affordable housing crisis here in D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing we found is that this type of initiative that you talked about today, it helps churches or synagogues or mosques that have leaders, faith-based leaders, who are knowledgeable about the process of development. They know how to apply for grants, they know how to finance a project, they know how to manage a project in the long term. Do you have any initiatives in place at the moment that help churches or synagogues, et cetera, that don't have that experience, that are just ministers, they just have the very basic theological training? In particular in this city, Southeast, for example, there's many African-American churches that are very much involved in their communities with social services, but they lack that expertise in development.
Right.
And they can't apply for grants, they have no idea how to do that, they have no idea how to manage a project, how to get development teams together. What is your initiative doing to help those churches that aren't already in the community development?
Right. I'll tell you something we can't do, and something we do pretty well. And sort of the wide angle view of your question is, these groups are valuable. I said it earlier. I was almost preaching about it earlier, how valuable these groups are in the grassroots. But we can't, as federal government, go out and provide adequate training to all these groups directly. There's just not enough of us, and we're not sophisticated enough to know who they are and how to help them. We're bureaucrats. I mean, we run government programs. So, so let me answer from the negative first, which is that you raise a great point, and what might be the obvious way for us to do it really isn't a feasible way for us to do it, just to go out and train these groups. So what can we do? Because we've thought long and hard about this, and the best way we have gone about this is intermediary strategies. So what we've done is create the Compassion Capital Fund and some related strategies to say, we probably can't do very good training, but there are groups who can provide two things to these grassroots groups that will help them out. One is to give money to them, and the other is to give training to them. So we formed intermediary strategies. Again, Capital Compassion Fund is the most notable one, where we say, let's do a at-risk youth gang prevention strategy, and let's figure out how to get to some of the organizations you just referenced. Well, if we hold a competition, very sophisticated competition for, $200 million, or among 20 cities or something like that, then a group that's very sophisticated at solving that problem comes forward. As a matter of fact, this is the same thing we did internationally. This is how we got to the 80% figure of working with exactly the kind of organizations you mentioned, but in Zambia, is we went to World Vision and the other large organizations, or in a domestic case with Gang Prevention Strategies, another organization that does that kind of work, and we say to them, we need you to drill down this initiative in communities. So we're going to give you a $8 million grant in St. Louis to solve this gang problem or AIDS problem in Zambia. And you get to keep 30% of that money to do some administration and to provide training sessions, because you can go out then and hold workshops because you know these groups, you know the good groups in your geography, and you actually have the language that could speak to them. You could really help them understand how to do their service better than a bureaucrat could go in and do that. But we also want you to not only give them training, but to give them dollars. So you can give out $20,000 grants to a lot of these organizations so that we can get service done at the local level through the grassroots. And it's very nimble and possible for them to hold a little mini competition to give a bunch of $20,000 grants away. Whereas for us, giving training away to these groups who we don't know and wouldn't know how to relate to them even if we did meet them, and to hold $20,000 grant competitions from the federal government is just not efficient. But through intermediaries, we can do that. And so we've actually trained a whole lot of groups that way. So we really haven't trained it, but we've sponsored the training in a way that, again, hopefully is sustainable. Because if we build up the strengths of an intermediary in that region with those groups, we've helped them today, but then they're in relationship tomorrow too. So, last one.
My name is Laura Johnson, and I'm a master's student, or a graduate student in the Master's of Liberal Studies program. And I just kind of had a follow-up question to when you were talking about the specific initiatives to help with prisoners and then those mentoring programs with faith-based initiatives.
Yeah.
The thing about that is interesting to me is I wonder if, the reason that most prisoners become prisoners again isn't because they're not faithful, it's because they're not educated. Most people that go to prison are of the low-income, low-education population. But
dropouts I mentioned earlier.
And like over the years within the United States, there's been less and less money going to education initiatives for those prisoners. Like, I can remember reading a study about 20 years ago in New York. Prisoners could get their degree or their diplomas when they were in prison, and most of those prisoners never went back into the system. So, but I'm wondering, kind of the implications
It's a great
of that
question.
coming from the state. If it's like we're telling you, we're helping you because there's going to be faith in your life, and you're not going to go back into the system. But I just don't.
Right.
Basically, maybe
Right.
is that shown to be successful?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, my read of the research is that faith and family are actually very strong predictors of reducing recidivism. If you can reweave family connections and those former inmates that have some type of faith connection, my reading of the research shows that those are big indicators for reducing recidivism. So I think I challenge the premise a little bit in that my reading of the research shows that those are factors in reducing recidivism. The heart of your question, the front end, why people get into prison, is very, very good point. I mentioned earlier the dropout problem and how many end up in incarceration. So then, it kind of begs the the continuum sort of question of prevention and early strategies, and where government's at-large strategies should place emphasis on social services and intervention and those sort of things, which are very, very legitimate points, and I think we would share points of view about that, toward the other end of the continuum where they are incarcerated and they lack high school diploma or GED and job skills. And so what does it look like to develop them pre-release and post-release? So we have something called Ready for Work at the Department of Labor, which was our first attempt at a prisoner reentry strategy in the Bush administration. And it is the first time that I'm aware the federal government did a prisoner reentry strategy at scale. It was a very innovative project. And what it did is started in partnerships with the Department of Justice pre-release and worked on counseling skills and worked on connection. You know, the get tough on crime policies of the past couple of decades drew a very strong line between pre-release and post-release. And so we can't do anything inside that would really establish social connections because they were so worried about criminal activity and you know, breaking out of prison and forming relationships for bad purposes following prison. Well, that also, you know, unintentionally lessened the safety net strength post-release. So we were reweaving that. And so we have pre-release strategies on training, and the Department of Labor is interested in, you know, connections to community college and skills building that will lead to jobs. That's their mission as an organization. And church-based mentors or social service-based mentors and other groups that follow this work. We have about 12,000 participants in this program. Are you know, a bit sort of life coaches. You know, so they may not be skilled in job training, but they can connect you to job training classes. And so actually our strategy is rather comprehensive, and I think I understand that the heart of your question, which is that, you know, we need to think pretty broadly about this, and if we did some things on education and services on the front end, that, you know, recidivism is going to be less of a problem because entry to prison is going to be less of a problem, and I certainly would agree with that.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. We've touched on a lot of key issues that will be with us for years to come, issues we're looking at here at Georgetown and at the Berkeley Center. Thank you all very much for coming, and please join me again in thanking our speaker.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.